big companies. We're going to move over to minorities. I'm watching my time. I'm mindful of it. Now, minorities. Remember the line we drew for minorities is like a flat line on the bottom of our graph. Immigrants, just how terrible it is. In fact, we had to go down. So let's just have a quick history. We can have head taxes, right? We had the story of the Continuous Passage Act, which led to the Komagata-Maru. By the way, the government of Canada has apologized for both of these things and actually given compensation for the head taxes one, right? Then we had, you've seen that list in the 1920s, just literally saying no immigration from China at some point in time, the increased head taxes and so on and so on. We get to the 1930s, deporting people from those countries. You know what I think I didn't mention in here, which I could, is the War Measures Act in World War I, and the treatment of Austrians and Germans being put in camps, right? We'd actually invited them to come to the country to open up the prairies, and we ended up locking them up during World War I. We get to the 1930s, we have people being deported, especially Chinese immigrants, race riots in Vancouver. World War II, things get a lot better. Oh, I'm kidding, they don't. We have the SS St. Louis, which is a ship sent back to Germany with Jews on board, women and children. They end up in concentration camps. And not just, good morning, Eli, not just the SS St. Louis, don't forget again the War Measures Act and the Japanese internment. The reason I do love teaching about Canada is none of this stuff is a secret. And in fact, the government of Canada openly admits to it and has apologized for it. Not that apologies end it all, but we have to understand our warts to be able to move on and get better. We move to the after World War II, things start to get better. Our doors start to open after World War II. We're allowing in a lot of refugees. Remember, that's the point of us joining the UN even, because we wanted to see the world be a better place. In the 1960s, the doors open a lot, and the biggest one, the biggest change is something called the points system. And the point system is how we have immigrants, we decide which immigrants are going to get in front of the line. It has nothing to do with ethnicity or religion, but it does have language, English or French, your career. Those things give you points, and the more points you have, the more likely you are to bump to the front of the system. Quite often in Canada, it's around what your career is. If we need doctors, and you're a doctor, you need an engineer, or if you're really good at building pipelines, hey, come on down. Today, we're just going to leave it there. We've come a long ways, clear, and we're a multicultural society. I can point that out too. We went from being monocultural when my dad went to high school to, French and English when I went to high school to, or I shouldn't say when my brother went to high school, to multicultural when I went there, and then finally we've even opened our eyes to this next one. Just starting to. So let's move over to First Nations. First Nations. The big word at the bottom is assimilation. Kill the Indian in the child, right? The key goal was to make First Nations peoples be successful in a white culture by assimilating them. How are we going to assimilate them? Your brains probably jump right to residential schools, yes? Okay, so, and we know the history of residential schools. I shouldn't say we know, we're beginning to understand the history of residential schools. Forcing children out of the home, and it's great to go after children if you want to kill culture because you kill language. And then what you do is when those children return from the residential school, you insist that they're the leaders of their community because they don't have the history. And I mean, you divide communities that way. So residential schools, we talked about a lot. They banned cultural activities like potlatch, and we talked about the potlatch and how we didn't really understand it. So I made that silly comparison of a potlatch to your Thanksgiving dinner, but with the whole family together being the one place you shared all your stories, and stopping it, right? Stopping it. Residential schools, potlatch are banned. We have reserves. And in the 1930s, we do something called cut-off lands, which means even though we gave you lousy land and put you on, we still were willing to take it away. It's the Lionsgate Bridge example we used. In the Depression, we gave them very little pogey. The argument was they could live off the land. World War I and World War II, wait a minute, I've missed something here. World War I and World War II are similar for First Nations in that they both gained, in it, many First Nations volunteered. A higher percentage of First Nations men volunteered for war than almost any other group. I think maybe than any other group. And yet when the wars were over and they came back, they didn't get the same pensions. They didn't get the same rights as the other returning soldiers. So just remember that one, no pensions. And finally, after World War II, we start to see some progress. So after World War II, they see things like in British Columbia, First Nations peoples are starting to get the vote, I think in 1949 or so, just in BC. In Quebec, it's not till I think 1969. Okay, federally, in 1960, and I'm not a big guy on dates, you know that, but it just gives you an idea. In 1960, First Nations peoples are now allowed to vote in federal elections. And so we are making some progress, but there's still incredible poverty. Of course, the bands have been destroyed by this history, okay? Not just through contact, but all these things that have been taking place, and then they're starting to try to recover. And it's here in the 1970s, we had that story of the white paper and the red paper. The white paper dealt with, and I didn't mention it down here, of course, the Indian Act. And the Indian Act basically gave government power over First Nations people as if they were wards of the state, as if they were like orphans, and controlled all their decision making. They suggested in 1969 to get rid of the Indian Act, and it was actually First Nations who said we can't because there's protections in it now, and there's rights beyond that we have to protect our culture. If you get rid of the Indian Act, then the culture will die. It's been damaged so badly, it will die. We still need to have reserves. We still need to have our communities protected this way. We move into the 1980s, and now we get into land claims and self-government. And this is a very quick review, my apologies, but the land claims and self-government, the land claim that went really sideways, of course, is Oka, where we have violence, the military is brought in, all about a golf course in Quebec, right? And we looked at that and the resolutions for that. The idea of self-government, we talked about at length, which is that it's not just that bands are going to be their own towns, right? We always think of the Penticton Indian Band or groups like this as being their own municipality, but in fact it should be more than that, and often is more than that. Is it a town, is it a country, or is it a province? We talked about the fact that it's probably all of those sort of mixed together. You know, First Nation, the bands aren't going to have their own militaries necessarily. They could have their own police forces. And in British Columbia, much of the discussion is what we call a comprehensive discussion because there is no treaty. Remember, if there's a treaty, they called it a specific claim. But in BC, there's no treaty, so they're having to work it all out. There's one band in BC that has managed to come to an agreement with both the BC and Canadian, the federal government, and they have their own territory, their own government, and what, can you remember what it was? Nisga'a. It's the Nisga'a. So in the Nisga'a is kind of an example of a great success story. And what's the other territory that was created in Canada? There it is. And that is a territory again, which is the results of a First Nations land claim. And now, not all bands are in the same place. And we know that. And that's one of the pieces we talked about. So from assimilation to, what's the word that we're using? This idea of reconciliation, to really make that next step, we have to be aware of the whole story. And that's why I didn't say we know the story of residential schools. You really don't until you talk to a person who's been in one, or read a story, or read some of the material and opened yourself up to it. The resolutions, the answers are different. What was given by the government and the churches to the survivors of residential schools? It's money, $4.1 billion, which a lot of people go, ooh, that's a lot. We talked about the fact that survivors, after the lawyers get their cut, and it all works down. We talked about one of the people who survived or went through residential school and had really heavy trauma, the heaviest level, received about $150,000. We talked about whether money can really resolve all that. It's certainly part of it, but for us to move forward on this question, we got to go further than that. All right. I'm gonna stop it. We still gotta do Quebec.